Okay, let's jump into it. I'm going to rely on you guys then to definitely do some more talking since we're a smaller group today again. So last three chapters here, a lot of this is a continuation of what we've talked about already as far as writing descriptions and how we do that. But now we're going to look at very kind of case specific stuff. So for example, in chapter 12 is easements and right of ways. And he kind of talks about land ownership and then what an easement is. And so I'll just read through this to give clarity to why this is its own chapter. He says, while the absolute ownership of land is expressed as a fee simple absolute, of which the short form fee implies the whole of the meaning, there are various forms of rights or interests or claims that may be placed upon the land, thereby encumbering the land. These may take the form of rights of access, rights of ways, and other easements, monetary interest, water rights, mineral interest, and various forms of rights for individual benefits, such as fishing. More on this later. It is not the intent here to explain all the ramifications of these encumbrances, but to alert you to their existence and use and discuss the relative form of descriptions. So any of us surveyors that do any number of ALTA surveys. I know there's a few people that steer away from them. I really enjoy them, kind of putting all those puzzle pieces together and seeing how, what encumbrances are on there and kind of the clear definition that goes into a true ALTA survey. But we talk quite a bit about encumbrances and where they are. And just like a fee title or ownership in a parcel of land, as surveyors, we address where are the limits of those rights? Where does that deed lie on the ground? The same kind of applies to easements. We should caution ourselves that we have to be careful about describing what rights are in that easement and sticking more to what are the limits of that easement. But just as with all our discussions, why that is the case, those lines are very blurry once we get down to it, into the nitty gritty. So a couple definitions. Easement, usually for the benefit of one or more individuals, is an interest in land of someone else and therefore constitutes an encumbrance on another's land. And so we deal with this all the time when we're particularly in today, when we're looking at original surveys, subdivision plats and the like, because there's all sorts of easements that get put on that, public utility easements, access easements, drainage easements, rights of ways, and the like. But we're also retracing these easements and writing them. One example that comes to mind for me is I recently updated what we call a blanket easement, an easement that covers just a whole piece of land that was written 60, 70 years ago for a gas line. It says, an easement over this quarter section for a gas pipeline. And now that we're subdividing the land, the owner of the easement or the person that has the rights, the entity that has rights, wants a more defined right of way width for their pipeline. And so we had to rewrite their easement and define it on the face of our plat. And so there's a lot of different ways we'll talk about here about writing easements. He talks about light and airspace, easements for ingress and egress, easement for telephone, other utilities. And so as we get into this, I just want to throw it out then to the group here of your experiences, challenges with easements, and any questions we can get into some of the chapter here as we continue on.
So I had a couple of examples, but we can pull them up later if we want. But just some weird ones. One I even just saw today on a piece of property, but more of a private road that is kind of goofy.
Yeah. So the gas example I gave, I wrote a centerline description for that. Let's just getting into examples and we can talk a little bit about it. So I wrote a centerline description, and the attorney for the gas company rejected the description because it was too vague. They didn't like on the beginning and the ending point of this easement is across through our property. I use the standard language, the sidelines of said easement to be shortened or extended to to cross the property line at the point of beginning and point of termination, and they said that was too vague of a description. So I actually ended up writing a full rectangular meets and bounds on that one just to get that one through. Here he's got light, air, and space, light and space easement, and I've never really dealt with like view easements, light easements, or space easements, but I was going to see if any of you guys had dealt with that, or any thoughts or any examples on that one.
Airspace would be sometimes the transmission lines too, with the way they blow, and so you got so much width with the airspace on the transmission lines. That'd
Yeah,
be
and
one
in
instance
my
we're
career,
dealing.
having worked in the electrical industry, normally that is still conveyed as a width easement, right, for a safety concern. But the way it is calculated, Trent, you're right, it's calculated in airspace. But I don't know that I've ever seen a transition line easement that actually has some sort of airspace bubble particularly described. But I know in Utah, there's been a couple of cases, particularly in the mountainous areas, where view or airspace has been blocked by a building, and there's been cases where they sue them because they thought they had a right to a certain view when they bought the land.
We had an expert witness case on one of those up in those $1 million homes that had their view blocked.
Yep.
We're starting to see those with solar arrays to have non-block
Oh yeah.
for access and that type of thing. We started seeing that about 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago.
And George, through in the chat here, airports have airspace easements all the time. We kind of talked about that before we jumped in here, but we deal with the Air Force Base here, and they have crash zones and no build zones and restrictions for, as you center off the Air Force Base, restrictions in height. Then they have runway restrictions, or APZ zones, which would be your nominal crash areas if there were to be an incident, right? So there are no buildings, no occupied buildings or residential buildings in those areas. And those are generally now just left as open space and farmland because we can't do anything, but those have been recorded over it. But absolutely, there's that. And then airspace easements, and I think we'll probably see more of an airspace easement or that type of language as drones become more and more popular, right? Or UASs is we've got restrictions in the code, right? In your Part 107 license and the code behind that. But I would dare bet that over the future we're going to see more and more type of airspace easements, then get into the Jensens and flying cars, right? And an air right-of-way easement of where you can and cannot fly, something like that. And it'll be a unique challenge as surveyors to learn how to describe that, for sure.
Another one, it's not so much easements, but I think we hit on it a little bit, the condo mapping, right? Where you buy in units, and it's not so much on the easement side of things, but
Well, you do have public utility easements in between, right? That common space is a public utility easement.
Exactly.
So absolutely it would be.
Yep. I was gonna throw one out to George because there's a Walgreens that's built over the NDOT right away on I-80, and I was wondering how that was actually that particular parcel was described and all that. Do you know much about that one, George, or no? He's got to find his mute button. He's got a new computer. Nope, you're still muted. George, you muted. There you go.
I have not looked at the description of that one, but I've driven under that particular Walgreens many, many times.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a bridge over I-80 is what it is. It's a block wide.
Yeah.
It runs between North Virginia Street and Center Street. Yeah, that you've got it up on the screen there.
Yeah.
Well, I've never looked at how that actually was described, but interesting for sure.
Yep. Yeah, that was one I've always, every time I get off there, because this is the exit to kind of get to our hotel or our conferences in Reno all the time, and I always wanted to do the same thing and look and go, how the heck was that parcel actually created? So, because it's literally over the top of NDOT right away. So
if you want, we can check the Washoe County Recorder's website and probably pull down the document that describes it We wanted to look hard enough.
I know, I'll have to think something, look, the owner, so this is on Parlay, but the owner says it's state of Nevada, so.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's probably some sort of lease agreement on
Yeah.
there. In the Midwest, you see a lot more of that where you have toll roads. In my work in Indiana and Illinois, you'll see quite a bit where you hit a toll area, pull off area that's got a McDonald's and a gas station.
Right,
Some
right,
of that is over the highway or in Illinois DOT
yep,
right away.
yeah, this is always one that's always got me, so. Crazy one.
I think the big thing to consider when we're looking at easements, utility easements, or really any easement, a right of way, it's an encumbrance. It is a right of someone else over your property, if you will, right? And so there are things to consider of what can and cannot be done over there, and we have to understand that a little bit as surveyors. If we are doing a subdivision plat and we have to incorporate existing easements on top, within our subdivision, we have to understand what they mean and how they affect what can be done to that property. And certainly there's some other parties, attorneys and whatnot that might be able to get into interpreting that, but we have to understand that for sure. One of the other things on 12.4 that Wattles points out is overburdening. Having too many easements in one area or on one property where it becomes essentially useless, right? Or you can't even fit that many utilities in there. So that's just something else to consider, and from a design standpoint, or even as you write easements. And then rights of ways.
Well, just with respect to the overburdening, I think part of that thing that we got to be careful of is not so much sticking so
Have a good
many
night. We'll see you in the morning.
sticking so many uses within a particular easement, but changing what the easement is used for. Like when you're providing an easement to a lot on the backside of a parcel, and then later on that guy subdivides that lot and increases the load onto that easement. That's not the original intent for it, so he's overburdening it based on that. That's a real common occurrence with overburdening.
Absolutely, that's a great example. Thanks, Jerry, for bringing that one up.
The-
That reminds me, one of my first instances as a surveyor, as a young rodman, where I was escorted by the police, was an example similar to what you just brought up, Jerry. Is what was intended to convey, or what was portrayed to convey, was a simple electrical easement down someone's sideline to connect into the main power system. But what was actually conveyed on paper, and I don't know if this was a malicious thing, I wasn't involved at that level, was just a general utility easement. And so when they started trying to lay storm drain and sewer through that same corridor, the homeowner that granted the easement was a little bit upset, and they kept pulling the stakes as we set them to construct those facilities. We ended up being escorted by the police so they could document those stakes were set for construction. It was always an interesting one as a young rodman.
I went and found, I had to go find the deed for the Walgreens. So it gives a full meets and bounds, but then it also provides horizontal planes extending from the following elevations. And then it talks about going from the soffits of an easterly beam, and then it provides elevation. So very similar to kind of what we're talking about, almost airspace style. Minimum elevations, midpoint elevations, pure elevations.
Well, at least they're identifying their vertical reference.
Yeah, I know,
Yeah.
exactly. There you go, George. We figured it out. It's still owned by NDOT. Obviously, it's just a lease, but this is crazy.
Mystery solved.
Yes, Mr. After all these years, I finally looked it up.
Well, go back to that parcel 2 there, just at the bottom of that last page there. That I just
Oh,
caught
yeah,
that. All that certain volume of space
yeah,
situated in the city of Reno, lying below the following described horizontal planes. Even
yep,
that's really interesting.
yeah, yeah. All right, mystery solved.
I love it. That was a great rabbit hole.
Yeah, I know, that's a good one. All right. Prime example of an airspace lease parcel.
On this overburdening thing, there's another situation I've seen where a landowner had an easement over someone else's property for access, and then they wanted to subdivide their property and create, I forgot how many, let's say 10 lots. And so now you were going to have 10 people using that access easement instead of one. And there was a dispute there about whether or not they could add more people as the inheritors of the rights of that easement, because it was supposed to be appurtenant to a specific piece of land for a specific person, and that's not the way it had been used for decades.
Well, a lot of it depends on the circumstances, because in some cases, if
Right.
the parcel's large enough, the presumption is that it can be expected the person can develop that parcel and therefore not overburden the easement in that context. So a lot of it depends on how the easement is written and what the character of the land is and what local common laws or what jurisdictional perspective is on stuff like that. So it's one of those things you gotta be really careful of.
Yeah, and in this case, it wasn't a very large easement. I think it was a 15-foot easement, or maybe a 20-foot easement at most, but it was not very wide. So to get two vehicles on the easement in opposite directions could have been precarious. I mean, you wouldn't be able to easily fit two vehicles. So, increasing the traffic along it was certainly a concern, because it wasn't wide enough to serve as even a private road under the zoning ordinance. But, I forgot what happened with that. I wasn't the surveyor dealing with it. I was just hearing about it and talking to the surveyor about it. But anyway.
Okay, yeah, great discussion. That's always something to consider is what changes, what local jurisdiction is there, and that's where we can, as surveyors, we can see where the limits of that easement is, but not necessarily speak sometimes to what the rights of that easement are, and that lies somewhere else. So it's a good distinction to continually make there. Continuing on here, he talks about different types of easements, and so the first one he gets into is strip easements, and he says, as the name implies, a strip of land is created either in toto or in segments, and that should have been total, I think, total or segments, either in the status of an easement or a fee limited to certain rights as stated above to accommodate a certain use. The strip, and I guess he does mean to say toto. Does anyone know? That's one I didn't look up, but I assumed that should say total. It was a typo, but I don't know. The strip in toto description is easy to create because after marking a tie point at one end, it takes off across country with little or no concern for intermediate ties to tidal lines until it ends somewhere. And I'm sure many of us have recreated easements that were just, here is an easement that covers a whole section or multiple sections, and then they're even granting off, that portion of the grantor's land that lies within this strip, and it's just a really easy way to write a whole easement, and they just do a whole bunch of small deeds using one description that may not actually, which is much larger than the individual parcel that we might be surveying. Have any of you guys ever written any easements like that or been asked to?
And a side note, Mr. Stahl's jumping in. Maybe he knows Toto.
And according to Webster's Legal Dictionary, it means as a whole in total. It's just another fancy way of saying in total.
Oh, just another way of saying it. It's a fancy way of saying total. Okay. I assumed as much or something like that. Jason threw in the chat here, I've been working on a strip easement that was established 40 years ago for a petroleum company. And now the builders and architects on the adjacent property are hemming and hawing and have had me look at it 10 times asking, is it still valid? All I can say is if the title commitment and title research hasn't unearthed a vacation, it still seems like it is still active and valid. Not a professional opinion, but between me and the PE at our company. And that's a good discussion to have when we look at easements is what is the duration of that, and has a lack of use allowed that easement to end because they by action given up their rights. And there's probably another more correct term for that one as well.
Yeah, the issue I see with easements isn't necessarily the description. It's the explanation surrounding it about what the rights are that are being conveyed. And we've kind of talked about that already. What the obligations and responsibilities of the landowners of the parcels are. That's where most of the confusion comes from. So even with a blanket easement, over the quarter section or in toto that goes over all of these parcels, I mean, that the easement, the description itself isn't usually the issue. It's making sure people understand where that actually is on the ground. So I had a discussion with one of my clients today where they didn't have an easement in the record, but there was a petroleum line that had been in place for about 40 years. Jason, I think maybe we're working on the same thing. But we know where it is, and we know it falls inside of another easement, which is specifically for access. And so the question was, well, how do we describe the easement that exists prescriptively for this gas line? And I suggested, well, maybe you just say you're vacating any rights to an easement for the existing gas line within this strip. And you use the strip description, which was actually part of a court judgment. Because there's a gas line, the gas line's inside the strip. There's a prescriptive easement for it. Who knows what the rights are, but you're vacating whatever rights may exist within the strip. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that was the best suggestion, but he thought it was great. And Toto could be Dorothy's dog. Yes, that's right. I agree.
I was thinking it, but I'm glad someone said it.
Well, there's no place like home, right?
All I could think of is he was thinking of slang chat words, making them shorter when he wrote this 50 years ago.
Yeah. So there is a thing, that you brought up, Jeremiah, is the easement description is one thing, but where is the utility that it belongs to as well? And whether it's a strip or centerline description or anything like that, often I found that older easements were written so they could go build the utility, and then they built the utility kind of sort of where that easement was written, right? We're looking at 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe even into the 70s in the area I practice here. So the easement was intended to convey an area, but they had to get the easement to start the construction, but they didn't have construction surveyors out there doing it. They just had the petroleum company, what the best place to lay the pipe at the time. And so there's a disconnect there about location of the easement and even the location of the utility and how those jive together as well, and what rights might be there. What makes that easy sometimes is an easement, a blanket easement, covering a whole piece of property or whole section, wherever the utility is. One of the challenges I found with blanket easements is often they'll say an easement for a power line over the southeast quarter of section 15, but they never give any dimension or width to it, no strip description to it. It's just an easement, and then we don't know what the limits of that easement are, more than it's just over the entire property.
Right, it's Seydu here from Cincinnati, Ohio. I was just asking Jerry today about an easement that what you just mentioned. I was asking Jerry for help and it was an easement where where it was platted and where it was built, it differed by 5 feet or even more.
And that gets into our boundary determination that we've been talking about for the last few years. Looking at the face of the document, and does that have enough information on there to move the easement to the location of the utility? Or is there something in there to restrict it, or some other means to say, look, this is where the right should have been, but this is where the utility was built. And that's a challenging thing to kind of put those two together. That's why I like a centerline description. That's his next kind of type of description as he talks about this is centerline descriptions. And those are a really clear way of showing intent as to, look, we're going to talk about the center line across this easement, or across this utility, and we're going to describe it and then give width to it. And I think I skipped a portion there as I was thinking, but centerline descriptions. Any thoughts, concerns with using those? They're my favorite way to write a utility easement for sure, especially if it's an existing utility. Okay, get back to my notes here a little bit, get back in order. He talks about, I'm jumping over to 12:13 here. He starts talking about stationing, which is always a challenging thing. We see this more on DOT type projects, occasionally on oil or pipeline projects. The one I see a lot here as well in Utah is we've got a lot of old irrigation ditches and canals and land drains that were installed in the valley when Utah first became a state, or they started developing in these counties. And these land drains are actually easements owned by the United States of America and then locally maintained by a water company here. And a lot of those have old stationing dating back to even the 20s. And it's, that can be a challenge because they'll call out an easement between station this and this of this pipeline, and you've got to do quite a bit of research to establish where that stationing begins and ends in the real world, and they don't always have a tie to a section corner or anything like that. Do you guys see much of those type of stationing easements where you guys work? Trent shaking his head no.
No, yeah, I would say not so much. Trying to think if I've even come across something like that, but
on DOT, we see them even on legal descriptions, right?
Sure.
Beginning at highway station, whatever, but there's usually ties then to section corners or some sort of monument that helps establish where that is. But I've got a few of these old US easements that just go along the station of the canal.
Prior to going to transportation project plans for land acquisition for the future for roads in Wisconsin, they used to use old right-of-way plats. And right-of-way plats were based on centerline descriptions, but they wouldn't be exclusively stationed. They would be a meets and bounds description of the center line, but they would also call out a station when they get to the PC of a tangent curve to the right, station number such and such as kind of ancillary information for it, but they wouldn't make an exclusively stationed description all the way along the alignment.
Yeah. And it's rare that I've seen the exclusively stationed one, but there are a couple floating out there for me.
I went back to that Walgreens to see if there's any stationing on there, but it talks more about the structure, Virginia Street structure numbers and that kind of stuff. But I was curious to see if there's any stationing on that as well. But
where you have seen them, Trent, too, I guess, is have you encountered station equations at the end of curves? Because that's the old traditional way, was to have a station equation at the PT or whatever you call the end of the curve.
sure, yep.
And to compensate for that. And that's largely gone out of practice with computer generated designs now. Traditional stake the center line first and then fit a curve in later on. You wound up with a station equation at the end of each curve.
And I've seen some of those station equations where they've rerouted even the land drain, where they were following an even station and a hard angle point, but they had to reroute it, but they didn't want to interrupt a station at the pickup point, and they didn't want to interrupt the state, going forward. So we have a station equation for the reroute.
In California, when surveying along the highway, which would be California Department of Transportation, Caltrans, you'll find a lot of stationing on their maps, and you will have a head station and back stations where they come together, and you will look at those and you try to match in if you can. They did a pretty good job when they did but everything is stationed.
I guess the question to ask here too, while we're talking about stationing, is does everyone understand what we mean when we say stationing? I think that's even a concept that might be a little foreign to some people, or younger surveyors. And it's just a way of writing a distance along a center line and breaking it up. And so normally you have a number plus a pair, right? Is the way we call it out. And so that full number, if you were to take out the plus, would be a linear distance along the center line. So if it was 345 plus 50, right? Your total distance along the center line would be 34,550 feet, right? 345 plus 50. And then you could get into decimals of that foot, 345 plus 50.5, right? And half a foot. But that's something that's always something that we're training younger, newer rodmen on, is they don't see that. That's not a standard one in my line of work in residential subdivision stuff, though it is on our plans. It's just not a terminology we call out generally. But you'll see that still on most civil plans. We just don't, it's not the vernacular, I guess. Okay, I'm going to jump to the end of this chapter here real fast. There's just a couple other points that I wanted to pull out, and certainly stop me if you guys want to address anything else. But he talks about other types of easements on 1217, and he talks about a license. A license gives personal privilege, unassignable and terminable at will to do something on another's land which contains no interest in that land and which is not required to be created by a conveyance. It does not pass to the heirs of the license. It does not give third parties a right to sue for interference with its use. An example is where an owner gives someone a right to park on his front lawn to view a parade. And so that's one type. And then a profit, he talks about a profit like an easement is described as permissible servitude upon the land. It is the right to take something from the land of another. He quotes California code. He says, in California, the code does not differentiate between easements and profits. The rules stated are equally applicable to both. The Civil Code section 801, 802 describe permissible servitudes upon the land, which include both easements and profits. I've never had to deal with any sort of survey that specifically talks to this type of easement or anything like that. But he talks of here, there are certain natural rights incidental to the ownership of land, which attach to and pass with the conveyance of the land. Even though not created by contract or conveyance, they are not, in fact, easements because they are not rights in another's land. For example, the right to have surface waters flow over one owner's land onto adjoining land, the right to receive lateral support from adjoining land for the preservation of the upper soils in its natural state. And a negative easement is another expression for equitable servitude, is exemplified by the preservation of light and airspace as previously mentioned, or by tract restrictions, thereby burdening each lot in favor of other lots. And I think another example of some of these type of easements are HOAs, CCNRs, covenant code and restrictions that go then with a development, and they're placed upon that as part of the overall development there. And that's what I wanted to cover out of these chapters and highlights of easements. Is there any other discussions, questions, things I missed, things you picked up on before we jump to the next chapter?
Can I share my screen and show a type of easement that we've seen start up in Wisconsin about 20 years ago or so?
Ready to go, Jerry?
Okay, right here.
And while Jerry's doing that, I was looking for some kind of legal description showing some stationing so we could do that, but I came across a couple of different presentations, so I just threw those links in the chat. But
We have an exclusion in Wisconsin surveying, a licensure law for surveying can be performed by non-licensed surveyors that represent the federal government or the state government. And we kind of work the state government out of it, that type of stuff now. But we still have the federal government can still perform surveys in the state of Wisconsin without being licensed. And the USDA through the National Resource Council or whatever the old soil service started a program called conservation easements, where they would put a conservation easement on the property and prevent that property from being disturbed and kind of protect that for the wetlands and all that type of stuff, which is a pretty good idea type of thing. But instead of contacting the local surveying community to help put together these descriptions, they just went out there and started surveying themselves. So this is a typical one that we encountered right off the bat. And we had long discussions with the USDA about this stuff. It's located in the corner, it's your typical capture. Commencing at a point located at the base of a stop sign on the east side of State Highway 73. Okay. That's bad enough. North 65 degrees east. Now, it says, as depicted on a drawing attached as Exhibit A1, okay? North 65 degrees east, a distance of 1,800 feet, more or less, to angle point number 1, being the point of beginning for this easement. Okay.
not the true point of beginning, though.
No, but it keeps going to angle points. And this says point witnessed by a steel fence post. So now witnessed by doesn't the same thing as being the corner. There's a witness to the corner. So it's an accessory. So we've got all these, and it goes all the way through this whole thing like this.
And just a second, we are in Wisconsin, so the drunk driver did hit the stop sign and it's moved. We got to make that clear.
Yeah.
Oh
So
my gosh.
Then it goes all the way down about a set conservation easement contains 19 acres, more or less. The basis of bearings and distances is a precise lightweight GPS receiver made by Rockwell International.
Oh my God.
Now, this is the property description of a drawing attachment prepared by a national resource. Okay, so it says this is the description, and the attached map is part of the description. So here's the map.
Oh my gosh.
This property description drawing attachment prepared and does not constitute a survey description or a plat, so basically what the description is saying is the description and the plat. This is out of the deed. Are the description, but in the map it says the description and the plat are not the description.
Oh my gosh.
We had long discussions with the USDA about this, and they basically told us to take a flying leap because surveyors are too expensive, but they have all these Rockwell GPS receivers that they can send Joe Blow out with and have him generate these things. So we tried to explain to them that you're creating an encumbrance on a property that somebody later on has to try to reestablish, and there is insufficient information in here to accurately locate these things on the ground.
Is there
it all started with a stop sign.
But is there any grantor of the easement? Is the landowner signing off on this?
Yeah, the landowner's getting paid for this. He doesn't care. He gets paid by the federal government, by the USDA, for putting part of his land into conservancy, which is generally the wetland areas anyway, that he's not going to be farming and that type of stuff. And somebody comes out and performs a survey for him, and then they file this is the description and this is the deed. So this is the easement. So it creates an encumbrance on the property.
Well,
And you have to
There's-
certify it on the ALTA for the wetlands.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you talk about your fuzzy boundaries, you know, and the fact that and they say it, they told us point blank, look at your law says we can do this because we're surveying on behalf of the federal government who's paying for this. So therefore, we don't have to have licensed people out there. We don't need licensed people. They have GPS receivers. We're not putting fence posts in the ground. We did get them to eventually stop using stop signs as points of commencement. No, I kind of crap, and do like we did and have to start at a section corner or a quarter corner.
Oh my gosh.
But we've still got all these other descriptors. So this is one of the shorter ones, but we've got them that go on for pages and pages and pages. So I just want to point that out to you, so that this is all sorts of anybody can survey, you know.
Yeah,
and
George.
the landowners, they're gonna
Easy,
get their
that one.
cash and they're gonna be happy, right?
Yeah, that's
They're
right.
not sophisticated. There are sophisticated landowners, but most don't know what that gobbledygook on that paper really even means.
Not
And
at
it's
all.
a pretty picture, and they trust that what they see and what they understand is exactly what's described, and that's not always the case.
And the fact that the document is contradictory, internally contradictory, because it's saying this is a description of the plat, and on the plat it says this is not the description nor the plat. Okay, but it's in this is the deed. You know, this is the instrument of conveyance.
So we don't have that type of mess, but we are seeing a lot more of these conservation easements come up in northern Utah, in the Cache Valley area, Logan, Bear Lake areas. We are seeing it's a city code overlay zone, just to talk about easements. But what they're doing is they are doing conservation easements to be able to receive higher density zoning in another portion. So I can preserve this nature walk area here, this wetland, this undevelopable area, and we write a description for that. And it's an agreement with the city. And then in favor of doing that, I get, X amount of density bonus, but there are easements and restrictions and descriptions that go through with that. But we're not seeing that type of mess, but that is a common thing we're starting to see here in the last 10 years or so. Okay.
So that I've worked up against some archaeological surveys done by archaeologists. And they'll come out and they'll pace with a compass direction and go out so far, then they'll draw an amoeba with no distances or courses on it. At least you had that on your map. And I'd have to sit there and scale everything. And of course, the county surveyor says they want a new archaeological assessment on it. Well, people don't have that much money. So, we argued that that we're expert mappers and that, we can scale, and that's how we got it through. But, it encumbered the property, but there's no way to fix it. So you just had to, hopefully you were not on any of that piece of archaeological property where they found Indian artifacts or whatever artifacts
we were doing a power line in Southern California. We're going to get way off topic here and not finish if we're not careful, but we were doing a power line survey down in Southern California. We had to have environmentalists and archaeologists walk the line with us. And this is when we were starting to do it. We're tying out section corners. And in the old World War II Army camps, they've just left trash there, right? The old tin cans, the food, and everything else. It's just piled out there. But because it's more than 50 years old, it's now considered archaeological. And they would not let us enter that area to go tie out the section corner that dates back 50 years more than the pile of trash that was left over from the army camps, because it was an archaeological site. So yeah, there's definitely some wonky stuff out there. So getting into that, tying out section corners, chapter 13 will push us here further along. It's descriptions of sectional land. And I don't plan on spending a whole ton of time in here. There is so much that we could spend, time in this one. I know there's plenty of mentoring Mondays ones, our Wisdom Wednesdays in both books. I talk a lot about the sectionalized land. Most of us have been West Coasters that understand and deal with sectionalized land. The beginning of Wisdom Wednesday this year of doing Wattles, I actually shared a couple of examples of an interesting court case that happened in Box Elder County in the desert west of the Great Salt Lake, in non-usable land, where someone just started sectionalizing off or dividing off a section that they had bought, and they were selling the parcels on eBay. If you remember that, we had like the south 2/5 of a quarter of a third of a third of a third of a third of a quarter descriptions, and they split that off into a few hundred different 2-acre parcels there. And but when we talk about descriptions of sectionalized land, we can get into what we call aliquot parts, right? Equal proportions of this. And the thing to remember is the sections themselves are perfectly imperfect. They are 1 mile squares. That was the intent. And that's what they are until we go survey it and realize that they weren't laid out on the ground perfectly. And we respect the history of what was laid out on there. And so even though it may not be a perfect percentage of that 1 mile square, the way we break that down into equal parts is we consider it all to have equal weight. They were simultaneously created on a township map, on a section map, and so they all have equal rights to itself. And so as we look through this chapter, talk about writing descriptions in the sectionalized land, we have to understand that the intent was one thing, and we respect that intent and approach it with that understanding that it was never laid out perfectly, but they were often pretty dang close. And then Trent's got up here on the screen, the most important thing is instructions for the survey of public lands in the United States. And there might be special instructions for the areas in which you live. When I was doing some stuff in Iowa, I actually have copies of 2 or 3 of the special instructions for the area of Iowa and how they laid that out. And as they went west, those instructions kind of ripened and they got more precise or more localized to there, till we got probably out more to the West Coast where it was pretty streamlined. But you may need to look at what were the rules that created those sections, those townships at the time they were created. And then of course there's more recent manuals, the 79 manual and the 2009 manual, which are really kind of our go-to nowadays. And certainly if you want to dive deep into this, getting your CFED certification is another great way of really understanding the nuts and bolts of what the PLSS system is. Jason threw in the chat, land grants in New Mexico and Southern Colorado have some really crazy things that are fascinating to read about. I'm not familiar with any of those. Jason, you want to jump in and share a couple of the interesting things you know about those?
Is my mic working?
Yep.
Oh, good. I haven't had a chance to test it out. Yeah, I just got done with my PLSS class at the university, and we got to do one of our reports was based on some of the land grants. Some of the biggest land grants in the country came out of the Spanish land grants, and the determination of the boundaries was just bizarre because there'd be a house, a homesteaded house, just out in the middle of nowhere, and you see this line that goes for 10,000 feet to the next section corner because they didn't have anything to reference it because there wasn't anything to reference. And those land grants passed across from the 16 and 1700s from the Spanish conquistadors and the people that were there, and it just got handed down. And every time they did this, they had to resurvey it. And then the surveys had to be adjudicated and brought through the process of the patents, because patents were part of the United States process, but the Spanish land grants pre-existed all of that stuff. So it made it very fascinating to see how it kind of concatenated the process of transference and conveyance of the property, the land, and then the rights that come with it. Because some people would come along and say, hey, I'm related to so-and-so, and they'd have to go back and reevaluate that. And that's real, it's real problematic, because who's going to reevaluate that? Well, who's still alive from that family? I don't know. It's and that's part of it, the magic of the PLSS. And also some kind of historical value, like how we got across the Mississippi and then straight across to the the Pacific Ocean.
And you will deal with that quite a bit in California, Texas, Arizona, and some of those other Spanish states. George, you had your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, one of the things I'm happy to say I was really involved with was working with Washoe County when they were redoing their zoning and development code. We have a mapping process here in Nevada called the Division of Land into Large Parcels. And according to that process, if you use the government plat to divide the land, the parcels are supposed to be 40 acres or larger in Washoe County. But we got the county to agree with us that if we did the map showing the distances per the original plat, the government plat, even though they were less than that on the government plat, if they were adequate parts, they qualified. And that was a big deal. And then what we would do is we would do that land map, and then we would follow it up with a record of survey where we actually set the corners of those parcels, so you could actually sell them and show the buyer what he was actually getting. But it was an interesting process, and it took quite a bit of discussion to, I won't say argued, but I'll say discussion with the county to get them to agree to that.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yep. Thanks, guys, for sharing. The book goes through here, the next couple of pages, just the real basics of townships and sectionalized land. So he even goes through how they're numbered, going through the fractional or lotted portions of it. He gives some examples of on the bottom of 13.6. When sections are cut up by a river, lake, or rancho, etc., the land between the regular areas, usually down to 40 acres, and the irregular line is cut into lots. He shows some examples on figure 97B here of how that might be split up. And so it's important just to understand, if you're new to sectionalized land, how it was laid out, that the township boundaries were the first to be laid out, and then they broke up interiorly to the sections, and then the interiors of those sections were then intended to be broken out by the local surveyors, the private surveyors at the time, but sometimes they were broken out by government surveyors as well. We've talked here quite a bit in Utah. We're more unique that the county surveyors have a responsible charge over the section corners in their counties, but you go out to other states, and surveyors can go set their own section corners and do their own work and monument that, and just as if you would a property survey, and that has its pluses and minuses, but at least in the more developed areas of Utah, it's been really nice that you're fairly consistent with corner locations, because they're kind of maintained by one entity. Are there any, do we have any East Coasters, meets and bounds states? So Joshua is, Josh, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Any questions about sectionalized land? Have you ever had a chance to deal with that much?
Fortunately and unfortunately, I do a lot of work in Illinois for gas utility and other states. So I have to delve outside my meets and bounds world into sectionalized lands. I'm starting to get the hang of it against my will.
It's really what you're used to. For me, it's so easy to do. I've done some stuff out in Iowa, in the military lands there, or in Ohio in the military lands in West Virginia, and the deeds are really interesting to read because they are overly descriptive because they don't have these clean squares to tie it to.
Yeah.
But I would say, and we've talked about this here, is sometimes we get a little lazy in our writing because we have clean squares to tie it to, and we just end up writing a quite true meets description with no bounds.
Clean squares that are really irregular rectangles.
Yep. I didn't have much more than that. I think we've probably hit on sectionalized enough, but I just want to talk about some of the things that are in here. It's a rather short chapter just to give an introduction to those that haven't had any experience with it. John, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, I was going to also mention that, in places like Montana and a few places in Utah, in Wyoming, some of the Midwestern states, you got entries that happened prior to patent, homestead entry surveys, and a bunch of different kinds of things. It's even ran across some stuff down on the south end of Utah Lake that are like they're farm surveys that were based on irrigation and such, and so they have their own little peculiar rules and such. And then you get out to the eastern part of Wyoming and Indian reservations. You get into things like the 3 mile method, which is an entirely different set of rules on those, running the lines east and west through the middle of the section to break it down. So there's a lot of really kind of strange oddities that happen in the public land system that's not your typical 300 or 640 acre squares.
The old 1320 club.
Yeah, right. Yeah, 1320 if you're running the right directions.
Exactly. I'll make sure I share it, but Jerry shared in the chat basically all of the Arizona files that have every PDF copy of the manuals all the way back to 1851, Oregon manual to the 1855 manual. So Jerry just made sure that we don't have to buy another BLM manual at another scholarship auction, which is not true because I'll continue to buy them. I only have like 3 left, but.
Okay, well, great.
Well, then
Well,
you
let's
can
jump in
auction
here to the
those
last
off and then
chapter.
buy them back later.
Exactly. It's always the case. Donate, buy them back.
Yeah. Well, and just on that note, we are actively collecting and saving all the unique stuff for not next year, but the year after when we join you again. So we've got some earmark items for you, Trent, to spend some money on.
Can't wait. I can't wait.
So jump into the last chapter here, chapter 14, special shape descriptions. So he talks about planimetric, tridimensional, aerial, subterranean, and navigational. And these are areas that I've never specifically worked in the context of unique descriptions or easement descriptions, land descriptions. I've done some descriptions of local airport here, but they're just usually utility centerline descriptions. And other than doing like a condo plat that has some dimensional aerial type layout on the plat itself, this is all new to me. So we'll go through this and see what thoughts you guys have. But special shapes, unique shapes. And he starts out with one I've never experienced, the description of a hexagon or octagon. He gives an example here on the next page, but he says, or any multi-equal-sided form can be accomplished without following by meets and bounds around the perimeter. The principle involved is merely to declare the pattern of the form and then relate the bearing and the length of one of its sides to a control line or point, being certain that the basis of bearings is included, and then look at the example to follow. So the first question I have for everybody, our experienced surveyors here is, have you ever retraced a hexagonal or octagon shaped parcel? What's the weirdest shape you've done that's just not crazy irregular, just tracked? A named shape.
Gotta be
Nothing. I mean, there's got to be something that he thought, at least back then, that it was worth putting in the book.
That's what I was gonna say. You came across it somewhere.
Never done one.
Yeah.
I've had one where it's the house plus so many feet to all the different sides of the house. You know, so it's basically the shape of the house, but at the time of the description, who knows if the house as it's configured today matches what it was back at the description. But basically the shape was based on the house itself.
Okay. Well, I mean, to the point there in the first paragraph is find a basis of bearings, and you can describe some sort of mathematical figure or shape, if you will, geographical shape there and geometric shape, and I guess that could be a tract if it needed to be, but the likelihood of us having to run into it is low. But I'll tell you what, if ever in your career you find a hexagon or an octagon or a pentagon, any shape like that, give me a call and let me help you write the description just so I can say I did. I'll throw that out there for as long as I'm practicing.
And just so you understand, the Pentagon is on a much larger piece of property. It doesn't have a description of its own.
That's funny. I like the swing ties too. I mean, that's something I think that's probably changed over the time of coming up and over, right? And as opposed to just a straight swing tie. So
Yep.
that's something that's, I think, progressed over the years as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Trent. That's something we really haven't talked about in writing descriptions is the tie to point of beginning. We've talked about basis of bearings, but we haven't talked about a tie to point of beginning.
Yeah.
You know, and we've kind of hinted at, I've noted here in Utah, it's pretty typical to have a, you know, beginning at a point which is north and then west to the point of beginning. And it's generally assumed that that north is north along the section line, working in sectionalized land here. And so even though it says north, you rotate that to, you know, whatever basis of bearings that section line is as you surveyed it. But a swing tie here is for those that are unfamiliar, is just that direct from the point of commencement, if you will, to your point of beginning, and it's just a straight tie. And there's really no way of rotating that into the real world, into your basis of bearings, unless there is a separate basis call in there. And so that's, you know, we've gotten better at writing descriptions where we actually have a basis of bearings call. So that was a great point. Thanks, Trent.
Yeah, definitely. Because this one could have been, you know, along the west line of lot 14 or along the, you know, south line of lot 14 or something, right? Or north, whatever the north right away of this east, and then come up and over. So you at least have 2 points that you can rotate and twist
and
it.
you can certainly recreate some sort of basis of bearings. It does say
it does say east
along the south of that lot, if you will. Yeah. Okay, so the next section is tri-dimensional descriptions. Turning now from flat areas to vertical enclosures, we find the old adage, individual owns his land from the center of the earth to the heavens above is being changed. The expanses of heaven and earth are being forced into much smaller confines of the pressure of the expanding volume of the requirements of our economic growth, compacting the volume of usable space. And so where we're probably seeing this more, whether it's a written description or some mathematical design parameter, is in our zoning requirements. You know, I've seen zonings that, you know, a max of a 3-story building or a max of a 30-foot high building. I in fact sent out an as-built map today of a home that, you know, the county required us to certify that the footings and finished floor were built per approved building plans, and actually that the roof ridges were at the approved elevations as well. And so we had to put a 3-dimensional diagram in there. Now that's not a written description, but I think that's what we're seeing more and more of this is. And what Wattles is trying to convey is probably the beginnings of what we're seeing now in many different areas with airspace use.
We have one similar subdivision that we have to do height verification as well. So just like you're talking about, finished floor to highest point of the roof. So make sure it's within compliance. We sent one of those out today as well.
Any other examples that you guys have worked with in vertical descriptions, or have you? It's probably more of a rare thing, but curious. Trent, you said you had a couple of court cases that you've been involved with.
Yeah, on the view obstruction, same thing. Yeah, where you, yeah.
I had a couple of projects for a cell phone company where they were installing a repeater on an existing building. And so the easement had everything to do with how high it was above a particular part of this building. It also was important because it had to do with radio, that the FCC needed to know where it was vertically in relationship to other vertical structures in the area. So there are certainly times when writing a description, the vertical component is important. I've found, of course, the most important thing when you have a vertical component is to clearly define what your benchmark is and where the hell you got that elevation from, because a lot of these vertical descriptions are left up to guessing, and you have to take it in context. For example, it was written in 1950 something, and so they're using a 27 datum, for example, the 1929 datum or something like that.
Yep.
But yeah, I've done it only a couple of times. Yeah.
Jason's throwing in the chat here that Boulder, Colorado has shade encroachment statutes. And then George, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
No,
You're on mute, George, again.
Mute.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, I worked on an ALTA survey for a certain hotel here in Reno that Trent's probably familiar with, that we ended up finding out was 6 inches higher than it was supposed to be, and it actually ended up in a navigation easement in the approach to the Reno airport. Not a good situation, but they ended up working around it. But yeah, and we had to use a basis of elevation for 2 different descriptions to figure that all out, and a lot of math work to figure out where we were within that navigation easement because it was a slope.
Yep. We were chit-chatting about that at the very beginning, about those slope easements for the airline, or for the airports running in and out of them on the runways. Yep.
Yeah, and if any of you guys have ever been to Chicago, the old post office building there, it's not an easement thing, but it was designed, just short enough that you couldn't fit the big postal trucks in there to actually get them out. So they actually had to do some unique things there to utilize that building. Each floor was just a little too short for that. Didn't take into consideration the full height of a truck with the wheels and everything on there. So some things to consider, some challenges of using aviation or aerial easements is like Jeremiah said, what is your benchmark? Where are you coming off of? Is it repeatable for someone else to go tie to that benchmark, right? And measure up from there.
Ground at the base of a stop sign.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And it's going to be more important again coming up with the 22 datum, right? /27 datum when it does come out. But I mean, all that stuff's getting reworked again. So
Yep. And understanding those, that's going to be the biggest challenge, I think, for our next generation, is understanding now yet another one, and how do those 3 interplay. I did a FEMA cert today that one survey was on 29, one was 88, and we had to match between the 2. And we've got some older surveyors and engineers that no, it is where it is, right? There's the benchmark, you build up from there, and we actually have to have a better understanding, not just the physical ground, but the air above that. And to the point of the book, the land below that too. We might see stuff, certainly I've seen minerals excluded on a deed, but have we gotten into where are those minerals? Where is the depth to do certain things? And not just maybe in a mine survey, but in other aspects of what can you do below the ground. We saw that, and they've got an example here, much like that the Walgreens that Trent had. But if you turn to 14.6, this is still kind of on the aerial easements,
Yep.
but you've got the space above and the space below. So what was natural ground could have been that upper area, and there's an easement or right now down below, and what can you do below that to one to affect the other.
He must have been Wattles must have been part of that Walgreens because that's exactly what it looks like.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then you jump to 14.8, subterranean easements below the surface of the ground can be written generally with the same format as the bridge description. Elevations will still control in their respective juxtapositions. In lieu of bridge supports, there may be required vertical air supply duct, elevator, stairway, or ramp. Easements as necessary appurtenances for a straight segment of a tunnel to be acquired from a certain property owner. One might use the wording such as, and he gives some examples. The one thing that comes to my mind here, so in Salt Lake City, the LDS Church owns a lot of ground, and they've actually built some subterranean tunnels and have crossed utilities. So I know a few examples of in these tunnels there is a sewer manhole, and it's the tunnel is privately owned and has crossed where this manhole is, and so they've stubbed that manhole obviously to not impede the tunnel. And so there is existing utility information of how to get the depth of flow line through that pipe, through that manhole, if you ever had to do some design. But I've never looked into it, never thought of it in this context. But is there any sort of easements between the two, between the church and the city, or something like that, for maintenance? And I'm sure there is, and how those interact with each other. But that's another subterranean type example there that I'm familiar with. Just like the other ones, I'll throw out the question here: have you guys ever dealt with subterranean descriptions?
I've only found it working in the oil fields in Kern County, which we have quite a few, is that some of the companies would own from, just below the surface to 500 feet. They'd have all the oil rights to that. And then you'd have another oil company below 500 feet. So never wrote any because they were already written, because all the leases are established in Kern County. But yet, you got to make sure that, what's going on, what they're doing is correct. I worked for Chevron Oil Company for 5 years, direct hire. And I'd go through all the paperwork on these leases to see what's happening. So they're out there for the oil companies.
And I've seen those in North Dakota as well. And that's just the nature of how they drill for oil. And that's where we become experts in our field, right? Not just in surveying, but if you're in the oil field, you have to understand how those are built and drilled to be able to write those. And that would be a very unique class to have, but that's a very niche skill, that type of description, and understanding the construction behind that. Okay, and the last one here, 14.11, is navigational easements. So since this type of easement has to do with airports, which are under the direction of the FAA, it would be well to consult with them relative to the establishment of any new navigational easements. There are FAA technical standards available from Washington, D.C., clear zone navigation easement, and model airport zoning ordinance, which are available from the FAA area office. He just says, in writing navigation easements, simplification is helped by separating the whole into parts. The vastness is not the problem, but rather correlation of the graduated and conical planes into their proper juxtaposition. Start with the plane area of the runway itself, and then fan out both laterally and vertically, where it might be expressed as diagonally aerially. Looking at the half plan in figure 106, the ratios of slope 51, etc., are shown in applicable areas outside of and beyond the runway. So, having never dealt with these, I'm just going to, if someone has some experience, feel free to jump in and share, but I'm going to just leave that as a point of reference there of all these transitional surfaces and conical surface, horizontal surface of, and if you jump Trent to the next couple pages, 1412 and 1413, they give some other views of what that looks like as far as the runway and the areas that, you know, the liftoff areas, if you will, that have certain easements. But there are airport surveyors that have a unique expertise in that, and there are companies that specialize in this. Anyone have an experience with navigational easements? Ever had to write one or retrace one?
I was looking to see if I could find some of the parcels around our airport as well, but
Yeah, like I said, the only one I've dealt with, having dealt quite a bit around our Air Force Base, I haven't seen any of these navigational easements, and I don't know if they're written in different ways because it is military versus FAA. But we do have what they call APZ, crash zones, no build zones, noise zones for the runways and the takeoff areas. And in one smaller city, I know Jeremiah does a lot of work there. Is there's a small municipal airport, and all the plats there have a note within a certain radius of the airport that there is a privately owned airport there, and the noise associated with that is kind of a due notice versus a recorded easement that goes over all the land. But it does get platted on our new subdivision plats.
When I worked in Las Cruces, we were actually actively putting together leases and stuff for new lots that were being acquired, and we had to go back through the FAA surveys. And King and Dubois is one of the names that you're thinking of, and there's also a couple of different companies in Albuquerque. But we had to go out there, and basically we were the ones that owned the land because it was the city of Las Cruces. But we had to establish the boundaries based on those navigational easements and also safety zones as well. And it was interesting because it just looks like a lot of space, but there really isn't a lot of space out there because it's all occupied by these weird oblique surfaces that are kind of across the entire area, which means that you can't build anything within a certain number of feet of this, or it has to be below X number of feet of that, and it changes the way that the lots can be sold and the value of the lots for sure.
Thanks.
At Reno Tahoe, they have both commercial, private, and military aircraft. And the commercial and military aircraft clear zones are different. The slopes are different. They're now flying C-130s out of there. They used to fly F-4s out of there. Done a lot of work on that airport where we extended runways on both the north end and the south end, and amazingly complicated to make sure you know where you are on that vertically. I've never had to write a description for one, but I've spent a lot of time studying the mapping for the clear zones, especially. Not an easy task.
no.
No.
I just threw this. So this is one we did 8 years ago. I was just looking back to try to find one of the ones that we had done on one of these expert witness cases years ago. But this would be one of just a generic diagram that came out of those navigation easements, that subject properties and how far out and all the elevations coming in and out. So.
Okay, and then Teresa threw out one here. A quick claim, let's see, it was a corporation quick claim deed that has some language in here. It is expressly understood that this quick claim is intended to release and surrender only the surface rights to the parcel or parcels of land above described, and for a distance not more than 500 feet in depth, and nothing herein contained shall in any way be construed to prevent, hinder, or delay the free and unlimited right to mine, drill, or bore, operate, and remove from beneath the surface of said land or lands at any level or levels 500 feet or more below the surface. So there's another example there. of one. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, well, that gets us to the end of Wattles. Any questions, comments, things you learned, things you want to share before we wrap this one up?
Another good conversation. 17 weeks for 14 chapters. So that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
That's really good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, guys. Have a great summer, and hopefully we get everything straightened up to get Pincushion Effect coming back in the fall for another Wisdom Wednesday.
I was looking September 11th would be the second Wednesday. So September 11th and September 25th. So tentatively, and that's after Labor Day. Obviously, Labor Day is on the 2nd, so that gives us time for all of that. So yeah,
that should work for me. Well, let's plan on it. Harmony, just before you jump off, these are at wisdomwednesday.xyz. You can rewatch all of our past ones, and then Trent also does Mentoring Mondays, and there are far more in-depth and localized conversations on all sorts of surveying topics there to help you with. But thank you guys for joining in and for your discussion. That certainly helps me moderate this and not just sit here and talk. And I have definitely learned from you guys, so I appreciate you guys and being on here, and look forward to seeing you in a few months.
Yeah, it was made a great job as always, Trent, and everybody that chimes in, Jerry, and all of our normals that jump in every week. So, like I said, this is much mentoring as it is wisdom. So it's a lot of fun. So I love it.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Have a great summer, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.